Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Birds Caribbean Symposium, Island Treasures, Lessons Learned from 30 Years of Avian Research, Education, and Conservation, here at the NAOC 2020 meeting. Birds Caribbean is a regional society for collaborative conservation to protect birds and their habitat throughout the region. I'm Dr. Ancelino Davis, a director at large in Birds Caribbean, and I encourage you to visit and follow us at Birds Caribbean on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We support the NAOC's commitment to diversity and mutual respect, and we support the meeting code of conduct, which reads as follows. This meeting code of conduct is intended to set clear expectations of behavior of NAOC 2020 conference participants to ensure that all participants at NAOC 2020 feel safe and welcome, and to ensure that NAOC 2020 is a positive experience for all. NAOC partner societies welcome everyone to NAOC 2020 and celebrate diversity in all its forms. We are dedicated to providing an inclusive environment that is collaborative, supportive, and engaging for everyone involved, and that is free of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. We expect all participants to help in our mission by being respectful and considerate of each other, providing supportive critique, and embracing the multitude of opinions that are on offer. Thank you for joining us. For today's first speaker, we have Ellie Davenish-Nelson. She has a long history of work in the tropics and regularly uses empirical and theoretical approaches to investigate wildlife conservation and management decision-making. She's a longtime supporter of Birds Caribbean, and in today's talk, she will share some examples from endemic bird conservation in the Caribbean to support conservation in our changing world. Ellie?
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Lino, for inviting me to speak today. So today I'm going to talk to you about what we can learn from Caribbean endemic birds about landscape conservation. So in the Caribbean, land use change and climate change combine to present the most significant threat to biodiversity. Most Caribbean landscapes are already greatly modified or impacted by humans in some way. Added to this is the limited geographic space and the complex land tenure across the region, with land ownership ranging from almost exclusively private to entirely state-owned. This means that conservation in the Caribbean presents a compromise between striving for formal habitat protection and the reality of working landscapes. Under the Convention of Biological Diversity, the Aichi target for protected areas is to protect 17% of global terrestrial area by 2020. So far, 36% of the 28 countries and dependent territories in the Caribbean have achieved this target. The average amount of protected areas per country is about 19%, although this varies well below and above this across the region. So we are doing okay, but there are clearly gaps in protection, and we also need to consider the 80% of lands that fall outside of this protection. The Aichi targets were due to be renegotiated at the UN Biodiversity Conference in October, which is now postponed until next year. There are growing calls to protect larger amounts of lands, with some calling to protect 30% or even 50% by 2030. In the Caribbean islands, this raises substantial challenges. These examples highlight the challenges with expanding protected areas in the Caribbean. It's clear that in some countries, even achieving the current target of 17% is not possible using formal protected areas, given the small proportion of state lands. Noting as well that these state lands on this figure include all types of land use. So increasing to 30% using only state lands to achieve this is unrealistic for many islands. This means we have to think about what landscape options we have outside of formal protected areas. Currently, there's a lot of focus on other effective area-based conservation measures, OECMs, which can be thought of as an umbrella for other managed areas that benefit biodiversity, such as indigenous lands, watershed management, or restricted areas. OECMs have not yet been formally officialized in the Caribbean, but in terms of other geographic conservation areas, there's a lot of focus on key biodiversity areas, which build on important bird areas. These areas have been designed to more systematically fill the gaps of existing protected areas. not all KBAs fall within protected areas, and not all protected areas are KBAs. And also, not all KBAs are on state land, so many areas are privately owned. But what of the birds? The Caribbean has approximately 174 island and regionally endemic species. Of these iconic species, 25% are threatened with extinction, mostly due to invasive species, habitat loss, and overexploitation. Of those species with a known population trend, nearly 60% have declining populations. And climate change is an increasing threat to many of these species, with the intensity and frequency of hurricanes increasing to levels that many of these birds will struggle to cope with. So what did we do? We assessed the coverage of 171 resident endemics inside of formal protected areas. We used IUCN range data, and we recognize that this has limitations as it can overestimate the area where the species actually occur. But these range data are widely used, and so they're useful also for comparisons. We define protected areas as those that have been designated according to the World Database on Protected Areas, and we use these to calculate the proportion of each species range that is covered by these areas. We then assess the wider landscape conservation potential by comparing this protected area coverage with areas that we defined as high conservation value. And so we use this as an example for the potential to increase geographically defined conservation areas, such as proposed with the OECMs. And here for this, we just expanded the current protected areas to include key biodiversity areas. So we added the KBAs that don't fall under existing protected areas to the 19% of total land area that's already under formal protection. And this increases the total area to 28%. And that's what we termed high conservation value areas. And so we then calculate the proportion of each species range covered by these broader areas. And then since most land is human modified in the Caribbean, we explored how this differs within and outside of those high conservation value areas and the impact on species range coverage. So we used the Human Footprint Index, which was developed by Venter et al. And this index is based on the intensity of the built environment, population density, croplands, nightlights and roads. Lands with a human footprint score of above 4 are considered to be modified, and a score above 7 is considered intensely impacted, and the index goes from 0 to 50. So what did we find? This figure shows the proportion of protected area range coverage by threat category, and the width of the boxes represents the proportion of species in each category. So we can see that our protected areas are really doing a good job at covering the ranges of threatened endemics. But still, we can see that this is only about 50% and 60% for endangered and vulnerable species, which are the larger groups of threatened species. What is clear is that protected areas aren't covering much of the ranges of near threatened and least concerned species. And of course, these species do often have larger range sizes, and there was a significant relationship between range size and proportion covered. However, when we consider that 48% of least concern and near threatened species that have known population trends have declining populations, then we see that we need to pay attention to these species as well. It's also worth reiterating here that range coverage doesn't say anything about the actual conservation effectiveness of this coverage. So here we show the comparison between the range coverage of protected areas and then when we expand them using KBAs to define our high conservation value areas. And there is a significant increase in the range coverage for all threat groups, with the largest increases being for the near threatened and the least concerned groups. But while expanding areas as a kind of geographic focus for conservation may provide a means for landscape conservation, these results also suggest that we are approaching a ceiling of what is possible by increasing our protected areas. So it's useful to put our protected areas in the context of the wider landscape. And here you can see that the average human footprint of protected areas and high conservation value areas across the region is considered to be intensely modified. If you remember that anything over 7 is considered to be intense. However, this is still significantly lower than the average footprint of all terrestrial land area across the region. So what this slide shows really is that our solutions have to be contextual. We need to use a Caribbean-specific metric as opposed to the wide expanses of intact landscapes that we often think of as protected areas. So what about endemics in our modified landscapes? We can see here that when expanding protected areas to include KBAs, the overall amount of intensely modified land doesn't increase significantly for most categories, but that all threat categories still benefit by focusing on areas of high conservation value, as there's a significant difference in range coverage under intense human footprint inside and outside of these areas. Yet, given that we know that range coverage for some groups is less than 50% in protected areas, and also that we're likely to overestimate actual occurrence using these range maps, it's clear that we shouldn't kind of shift our focus away from formal protected areas, but really rather broaden our focus. So this means not only improving protected area effectiveness, but also strengthening the opportunities like those provided by private lands and traditional agriculture and livelihoods. And as we just heard in the keynote, the new proposed targets of 30% or 50% are really unlikely very unrealistic. And we need to think more about local solutions, including in human-dominated landscapes, and make sure that we take small range species into account. So there are many local success stories using these broader landscape approaches, many of them supported by Birds Caribbean. And you'll hear some of these great stories in the talks during the symposium. So importantly, these projects work across the spectrum of landscape conservation, from protected areas to KBAs and private lands. Some of these projects include the control of invasive species in Antigua, community management planning in Jamaica, community education in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the sustainable tourism developed by the Caribbean Birding Trail, and the huge awareness generated by the Endemic Bird Festival. And the success of these projects comes really from being truly participatory, engaging local decision makers, building long-term partnerships, and integrating and sharing local knowledge. And all these projects have used locally appropriate interventions that can lead to landscapes being shared, even if they're really intensely used, as we see that most of our landscapes are. And this can benefit even critically endangered species, as they show. And these projects demonstrate that small investments in broader landscape engagement, including protected areas, but importantly expanding to private lands, can have big positive impacts on the conservation of our endemic birds, their habitats, and the communities that share them. So really, our results highlight the need to protect the full suite of endemics, not just a threatened species, with the kind of ultimate aim of promoting species interactions and ecosystem functioning that's necessary for maintaining landscape resiliency for birds and for humans. We see that increasing formal protection on many islands is unrealistic, but this doesn't mean that the Caribbean shouldn't engage with the renegotiation of the Aichi targets. The Caribbean should be pushing for the need to reconceptualize how we achieve landscape conservation, using OECMs, KBAs, and the broader landscape actions that are already being successfully implemented at local scales. And these projects demonstrate that endemic species provide an opportunity to provide a real sense of ownership of the Caribbean's cultural and natural heritage. And finally, in this year that was supposed to include the UN climate change and biodiversity conferences, we hope that a silver lining of the COVID pandemic is an opportunity for the Caribbean to reflect on its relationship with its changing landscape. And with that, thanks to Birds Caribbean for letting us present, and